Welcome back to another weekly market and financial update. So, this week we're going to talk a little bit about the soft landing that has been making some headlines recently in the media and what that means for us as consumers and investors. So, the IMF recently came out with a report and said that they are actually anticipating a soft landing from the Fed and the global markets, meaning that the Fed and the global markets and global banks have done their job of successfully navigating us through high inflationary periods, and they'll get us back into a smooth economy versus pushing us back into a declining economy or even a recession. And this was a lot of talk. There were a lot of conversation about what's going to happen. And the IMF, they came out with this data because they said a lot of the supporting data looks really, really good, right? So Q3 earnings have been overall pretty strong, not as strong as the second quarter, but still overall beating analyst estimates. We've seen the rest of the markets really come alive as well. For a long time, we talked about, if you've been watching the videos really earlier in this year of 2024, we talked a lot about the Magnificent Seven and how the Magnificent Seven, the major seven tech stocks, right? Apple, Amazon, Google, etc. These seven stocks really carried the entire breadth of the market. I mean, there were really no other companies or stocks that were really making much of a difference except for these seven. So when people saw the S&P 500 index up 20-30%, it was really just attributed to those seven particular companies. And now recently, the remaining 493 companies in the S&P 500 have really started to narrow the gap in terms of earnings and growth potential. So what that means is that the rest of the economy, other companies, they are providing additional supporting data to central banks like the Fed and the IMF to say that, hey, we're actually doing better than really what people originally thought of us outside of the Magnificent Seven. So this is all really, really good data and exactly what we want to see, especially when you're making the argument of what's going to happen between a soft landing or being pushed toward a recession. Now, if these companies didn't come alive, then we'd have a different conversation, right, about the higher elevated chance of us being pushed toward a recession. But overall, I mean, things have looked really good. The labor market, while it is cooling off, has still remained strong. Unemployment is really the number to consider around a soft landing versus being pushed toward a recession. If unemployment figures were elevated, then we could say, okay, we're leaning more toward a recession than a soft landing. But unemployment has really stayed below 5%. And typically around recessions, a really good leading indicator of the economy heading towards some dark clouds are layoffs, right? Mass layoffs, right? We saw this in 2008 when people, I mean, you would talk to your next door neighbor, yourself, your parents. I mean, pretty much maybe 2 out of 3 people you spoke to on any given day said, yeah, I got laid off today, or I'm getting laid off in a week, right? And we're not seeing that this time around. So this is a much, much different scenario. Now, the only caveat I think to this that will just create some additional uncertainty and volatility in the markets, of course, is the election, right? The presidential election will have an impact on the global markets because the U.S. is such a powerhouse when it comes to global trade, imports, and exports. The U.S. really takes in a lot more imports than it does exports, meaning that if tariffs are implemented, if there's any changes to geopolitical relations or any tensions or even improvement, right? On the flip side, right? If things improve, then that will have an effect on the markets and ultimately affect global trade. So I think that's really the only caveat there is really the election. But otherwise, numbers have looked really, really good. I mean, the economy is slowing down. We've talked about this. Second quarter earnings were in the low to mid double digits, and third quarter earnings on average are probably around 4 to 6%. So middle single digit, which definitely is an indicator that the economy is slowing. But this is what the Fed and global banks have pushed toward, right? They have really pushed to get inflation under control. And to their credit, I think they've done a good job. We can talk a little bit about the timing of things. Did they start too late? Did they start too soon? That's another debate altogether. But with the work they've been doing, I think that they have done a good job in terms of just getting inflation back under control. Core inflation, really one of the the big indicators is starting to creep back down toward the 3% and 2% levels. And that's really where the Fed and global banks want to see inflation in the overall economy. So as long as these trends continue and we can keep inflation relatively under control, then that will be just another argument to lead toward the soft landing. Whether that'll take place this year, I mean, probably not with the election. I think there's still too much speculation around who's going to get elected. But I would say in 2025, we'll have a clear enough picture of whether or not we actually reach the soft landing or not. And I think there's a pretty good chance. I'd probably say it's about a 75% chance that we're going to reach the soft landing. And so, nothing is guaranteed, of course, right? But just knowing that there is a good indicator there should give investors some confidence, especially as we close out the year. This will really support market valuations and then ultimately support each and every one of our individual investment portfolios, which at the end of the day, that's what matters most to us, right? We want to see our investments grow and improve over time and try to minimize as much downside as we can and minimize as much risk as we can. So knowing this data, I think, will help just give us better decision making as we close out the remainder of 2024. So thank you so much for tuning in today. I always appreciate everyone tuning in and watching, and we have the election coming up in a couple of weeks, so we're going to have a lot of conversation around the elections. Stay tuned. Thank you so much again for tuning in. Enjoy the beautiful weather, and I'll see everyone next week.